It began as so many things did in St. Mildred's with cake. The annual harvest tea at the village hall had arrived with all the dependable cheer of a ticking clock. Bunting flapped lazily in the breeze outside, while inside the scent of warm scones, honeyed apples, and freshly brewed Darjeeling floated beneath the high beams. The tables were decorated with ironed linen and forget-me-nots from the vicar's garden, and an outstanding array of baked goodies stood proudly at the middle like tasty prizes. Miss Jane Marple sat near the back, knitting in her lap, a quiet witness to the Ville's rituals. To the casual eye, she seemed merely a sweet old lady in a dusty pink cardigan, but her pale blue eyes, sharp behind wire-rimmed spectacles, missed nothing. Not the tremble in the vicar's wife's hand as she poured tea, nor the subtle way young Ivy Broadley flinched when Mr. Templeton passed behind her. "Mrs. Partridge outdid herself this year," said Miss Hartwell, taking a generous bite of Miss Marple nodded, but her gaze had wandered to the main table. There in the center of the dessert display was the cake, a towering Victoria sponge with layers so symmetrical it was nearly architectural. A dusting of icing sugar clung to the top like early frost, and in the center, iced in delicate handwriting, were the words to sweet endings. How poetic! Miss Hartwell mused. "A bit dramatic, don't you think?" "Yes, miss," Marple murmured, "or deliberate." She didn't elaborate. She never did, not until she was certain, but the cake nagged at her, not just the message, but the feeling that something was staged too perfectly. It was baked by Mrs. Elizabeth Hargrave, the baker's widow who had only recently returned to the village after nearly 2 decades away. Her late husband Bernard had run Hargrave's breads until his heart gave out on a cold. Tuesday, Elizabeth's return had caused a stir. No one had expected her to come back, let alone take over the bakery again, but there she was standing tall by her cake in a navy dress, her graying hair in a tight bun, and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The villagers were polite, of course, as was the way in St. Mildred's, but polite didn't mean welcoming. Her voices softened when she approached, and some, like Peggy Wilkins from the post office, made no effort to "Odd, isn't it?" Miss Hartwell asked, rubbing her lips. "How else just waltzes back and pretends nothing ever happened?" Miss Marple said nothing from across the room. Reverend Sims lifted his teacup in toast to the women of St. Mildred's, declaring with a wide smile, "And to Ellsworth, whose cake might just be the finest I've ever tasted." There were scattered claps and a few reluctant nods. Elizabeth smiled politely again, and Miss Marple noticed a brief flicker of tension in her jaw. Not pride, but resentment. Then just before the applause faded, a man at the edge of the room staggered. It was Mr. Harold Duckworth, the solicitor. His face had gone pale, his eyes wild, and his hand clutched at his chest. "I don't feel," he began. Then he collapsed onto the floor. A gasp rippled through the room. Someone shouted as the vicar's wife dropped a platter of scone. Miss Marple did not budge from her chair as she watched Dr. Linden, who was already on the scene, knelt beside Harold with his fingers searching for a pulse. "Get him on his side," he screamed. "Now!" Miss Marple looked back to the dessert. 2 nice ends. Was it a message? 10 minutes later, the hall had emptied. Only a few remained: Dr. Linden, the Reverend, the vicar's wife, and Miss Marple, who hadn't budged. Harold Duckworth had been revived, but taken home pale and feeble after a suspected fainting fit. Dr. Linton had stated dehydration or nervousness, but Miss Marple was not convinced. She had lived too long and seen too much to believe such things at face value. Elizabeth remarked. Reverend Sims approached the baker with soft sympathy. "No one's blaming the cake, you understand." "Of course not," she said evenly. "Victoria sponge. Eggs, flour, sugar, nothing more." Nonetheless, the vicar's wife added carefully, perhaps next time a less foreboding inscription. Elizabeth stiffened. "It was meant to be charming, I'm sure it was." Miss Marple said quietly. Knitting paused in her lap. "But words have a strange habit of meaning more than we intend." Elizabeth looked at her, and for the first time, Miss Marple Saw something unguarded, not fear, not guilt, sadness. And something else, perhaps guilt, but not for Harold the Reverend, turned to Miss Marple. You are not claiming that there was foul play. Definitely no, Reverend. She remarked, folding her knitting carefully. Not yet. But even as she rose from her seat, she knew something had been set in motion. And it had begun with Cake before going on to the next detective. Where in the world are you solving mysteries? With us. Drop your location in the comments. And if you want more twisted tales, hit subscribe. Tomorrow's case file is much darker. By morning, the hamlet had already begun to forget that was the way of St. Mildred's disturbance was graciously wiped aside with fresh scones and cheerful walks. Mr. Duckworth's fainting spell had been cranked up to weary the tea party's tension, disguised as lively chatter and whatnot. Hargrave's cake? No one discussed it aloud, but there were mutterings in corners, just enough to keep the air unpleasant. Miss Marple stopped by the bakery window the next afternoon, staring through panes dimmed slightly by flour dust. A fresh sign hung just inside the reopened Hargrave's Bakery Estro, 1912, behind the counter. Elizabeth moved with experienced elegance, a woman used to kneading, lifting, and slicing without waste of effort. Her hands, though elderly, operated like clockwork, calm and clean mechanically. Miss Marple came inside. A little bell above the door rang crisply. "Good afternoon," she said cordially. Elizabeth looked up, her eyes showing little surprise. "Miss Marple," she continued, "I thought you might come. You did after yesterday's excitement." She nervously grinned. People don't faint often at village teas, especially not Harold Duckworth, that man's made of vinegar and paperwork. Miss Marple made a tiny smile. He does strike Bun as durable. The bakery smelled of almond and lemon peel. The counters shined behind racks of cooling tarts lined up like soldiers, exact and clean with no assistance. No chatter, just silence and the steady hum of the ovens. "I hope you don't mind my phoning in," Miss Marple replied gently. "I was curious." Elizabeth crossed her arms, flour dusting the edge of her sleeves about the cake. "Yes, it was pretty beautiful." A pause. "Thank you, but I wondered." Miss Marple went on about the inscription. Elizabeth's face stiffened slightly. It seemed thoughtful, perhaps too thoughtful. "I thought it would be fitting," Elizabeth said, "a return, a closure." A harmless phrase unless someone decides to give it meaning. A long silence followed. A timer ticked softly, and Elizabeth said, "Would you like to see the kitchen?" Miss Marple blinked. "If you don't mind." She followed Elizabeth behind the counter, through a short hallway and into the back. The warmth hit her, a dense yeasty heat, thick with spice and dough trays, lined every surface. An ancient oven rumbled in the corner, its iron mouth closing tight. "You've preserved the same oven," Miss Marple noticed. Elizabeth nodded. "Bernard had it shipped from Yorkshire in 1938 and said it baked bread like nothing else. I couldn't part with it, even after all these years. Something shifted in posture. It remembers things. I suppose I do as well." Miss Marple ran a finger gently along a nearby tray. "Did Bernard ever bake with messages? I recall once during the war he made loaves in the shape of letters for a children's fundraiser." Elizabeth smiled faintly. "That was actually my idea. But people resented him. Bernard could be brutal, and just because a coffin closes doesn't mean that animosity goes away." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And what about you, Mrs. Hargrave? Do you feel safe being back?" Elizabeth did not respond right away. Instead, she turned to the oven, her palm resting momentarily on the handle, fingers tracing the old brass, and muttered, "There's something about this place, Miss Marple. The walls remember things sometimes, and I think I hear them at night." Miss Marple inclined her head. Elizabeth flashed a false grin. Nothing was obvious, just uneasy sounds like breath behind a door before Miss Marple could answer. A harsh knock echoed from the front. Elizabeth wiped her hands on her apron. "Excuse me, left alone in the warmth of the kitchen, Miss Marble's eyes swept the room. There was no mess, no chaos, no fingerprints of panic or cover-up. But by the far wall beside the sack of rye flour, she noticed something odd, a piece of parchment. Small, square, folded. Once she bent, careful not to disturb the rest of the workspace, and picked it up. The paper was thick, old. It smelled faintly of cinnamon. Unfolding it, she read this single word. "Elizabeth," she added happily. "You truly haven't lost your touch. The place looks spotless." Elizabeth gave a nod. Her eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "You're kind to say." Outside, the autumn sun had dipped lower, casting long shadows across the green. Miss Marple walked slowly back toward her cottage, the word turning over in her mind like a stone in her pocket. Forgive. Not an apology, a command, and perhaps not meant for the living. Chapter 3. The next ripple came not from the bakery, but from Ivy Broadley's orchard. It was mid-morning when the first whispers began at the grocer's by the chapel gates, and in hushed tones along Church Row. "Mrs. Duckworth's been sick," muttered old Mavis Cribbs as she passed Miss Marple's gate, her voice ripe with implication. "Same as her husband. That's two from the same table." Now Miss Marple, seated with her embroidery beneath the front window, paused with her needle knitter. A slow unease curled through her chest. Coincidence? Rarely visited twice in the same week. By noon, Ivy Broadley's apple tart had become the village's silent suspect. She brought it to the harvest tea, said Peggy Wilkins from the post office, and set it right next to Elizabeth Hargrave's sponge like she wanted them side by side. "She always did have a flair for show," said the vicar's wife with a brittle laugh. Even her grief was theatrical. Ivy had been widowed 2 years ago, and since then had taken to overseeing her orchard with the pride of a monarch guarding lost territory. Her apples were famous, crisp, tart, unusually red, and each autumn she delivered jars of spiced apple preserves to the villages like offerings to a weary kingdom. Miss Marple found Ivy in the orchard itself, pruning late branches with her usual briskness. She wore gloves and a green kerchief tied under her chin. The air smelled of cider and cold soil. "Well," Ivy said without turning, "I suppose you've come to ask if I've poisoned someone." Miss Marple blinked, then chuckled softly. "No, dear, I merely fancied a walk, though I wouldn't say no to a jar of your cinnamon jelly flatterer," Ivy grumbled, snipping a final twig. "You're too bright for strolls without purpose." Miss Marple folded her hands over her cane. "And I admit it. I've been thinking about the harvest tea and the rest of the county." Miss Marple tilted her head. "People are quick to assign blame, especially when it comes in pastry form, because cake and truth don't mix well." Ivy turned to her, her eyes shaded beneath her scarf. "But you know that already." They stood in silence for a moment, broken only by the distant bleating of a sheep and the rustle of orchard leaves. "Your tart was quite popular." Miss Marple offered several slices, disappeared before the bread. "I use cloves and a bit orange zest. It lingers on the tongue and makes people think it's richer than it is." Harold Duckworth had a slice, of course. He took 2, and his wife, who prefers sponge, claimed mine was too adventurous for a solicitor's wife. Ivy rolled her eyes as if I'd laced it with alcohol. Miss Marple smiled slightly. "I don't suppose you noticed anything weird about the food table or the individuals?" Ivy hesitated, brushing a speck of bark from her sleeve. "It wasn't unusual. But Reverend Sims said something about Elizabeth before the toast that made her flinch." "What was it?" "It's lovely to see you back, Elizabeth, though some ghosts don't take kindly to company." I thought it was just his clumsy humor. Miss Marple frowned, and her reaction was to smile. Ivy responded, but the sort of smile you use when someone steps on your foot in church and you want to scream. Miss Marple glanced at the wooden basket by Ivy's boot. Inside were apples, perfect, glistening, unnaturally red. "Your apples do seem brighter this year," she said. Ivy gave a hollow laugh. "Funny that they grow best when something's buried in the soil." By evening, Mrs. Duckworth had recovered enough to open the curtains. Dr. Linton had prescribed rest and light food. "No more sweets, no orchard preserves, no cake," Peggy in the general store remarked. "I suppose we'll all be back on toast and broth by Sunday." But Miss Marple was thinking about something else. 2 sicknesses, 1 message, and a single word folded beneath a sack of rye, once returning home. She set the note on her table. Its immaculate calligraphy had begun to smudge from her hands. Lavender saw she inspected it once more, then opened. Her old village map. She sketched a triangle in pencil. Hargrave's Bakery, the orchard, Duckworth's home. 3 sites all related not by geography, but by history. Ellsworth had left the village under a cloud, though no one had ever stated it aloud. Bernard Hargrave's death had been certified natural, but there were stories about fights about the will about Ivy's orchard being tied in a debt the Harraves never paid off, and now she was returning a cake with a message. A solicitor who collapsed a second victim was mute and still. Miss Marple closes her eyes. Something had begun, but it hadn't began with cake. It had begun years earlier, buried beneath polite silences beneath the roots of Ivy's trees and the ash of Bernard Hargrave's oven. Chapter 4. The postmistress Peggy Wilkins rarely made mistakes for 23 years. She had sorted, stamped, and dispatched every letter that passed through. St. Mildred's with the devotion of a high priestess tending sacred scrolls, so when Miss Marple stepped into the post office the next morning and asked about the outgoing mail from the day before the harvest tea, she was met with a mixture of suspicion and pride. "Why do you ask?" Peggy said, adjusting her spectacles, expecting something late, but not. Mrs. Hargrave squeezed Peggy's brow. "No one recently, not since she returned, come to think of it." "Why, she mentioned writing to someone." Miss Marple lied gently, "but I wasn't sure whether she'd sent it. And if she did, it didn't go through here." Peggy reached for a small leather ledger with unnecessary flair. "I log everything from her, you see, habit, Miss." Marple nodded. It was precisely what she expected. Later, she stood once more outside Hargrave's Bakery. The window display had changed. Apple turnovers, today glistening under powdered sugar, but the words on the small chalkboard remained to sweet endings inside. Else worked alone as usual. She moved slower today, less sure. Miss Marple did not enter. Instead, she circled Behy. Mrs. Ivy, Broadley, Orchard House, Church Lane. There was no stamp, postmark, or contents inside, simply the faint and lingering aroma of garments. That afternoon, Ivy Broadley stood on Miss Marble's doorway with a basket of damaged apples and a restless expression in her eyes. "You spoke to Peggy," she began plainly, "and I suppose you've seen Elizabeth again." Mistress Marple motioned to the bench near the hydrangeas to come sit. Dear Ivy sat, but did not relax. She fidgeted with her scarf. "She was in love with him, you." "No." Mistress Marple gave her a steady eye. "Bernard." "No." Ivy said, "My husband Gerald." Miss Marple's hands went still in her lap, and she never uttered anything. Ivy kept her voice flat. "Not out loud, but there were looks, letters she never sent, and I found one after Gerald died hiding behind the flour bin in the old pantry. It stated that she couldn't bear the way he looked at me." Miss Marple's breath remained sluggish. "Did he return that affection?" "No, Gerald adored me." A faint bitter smile. "But he liked attention, flirting, and Elizabeth was younger, then prettier, and resentful over Bernard. I always wondered if she believed taking Gerald would square the scales." Miss Marple folded her hands. "That must have been very difficult. It was a lifetime ago," Ivy said, standing, "but I know what I saw in her eyes yesterday, when Harold collapsed. It wasn't shock, it was regret." As Ivy left, Miss Marple remained still on the bench, her mind winding through memories like spools of thread. The empty envelope now sat on her writing desk, Ivy's name, Elizabeth's writing, no letter. Inside, just silence that evening as twilight fell over the village. A third whisper reached Miss Marple's door. This time it was from Dr. Litton. He arrived without calling ahead, unusual for him, and lingered on the front step with a restlessness that betrayed more than professional concern. "I shouldn't be saying this," he began, "but Harold Duckworth isn't improving." Miss Marple opened the door wider. "You'd better come in, Doctor," in the parlor with the fire roaring and teacups in hand. Dr. Linton sat forward. "There's nothing medically visible," he admitted. "Vital stable. No toxins I can identify, but he's fading, no energy, nausea, dizzy spells, and Mrs. Duckworth is recovering slower than planned." but recovering. Miss Marple sipped her tea. "Do you think something caused this?" He hesitated. "I don't like coincidences, especially not grouped around one event." But Miss Marple claimed no one saw anything. No powder, no weird flavors, only sweetness and smiles. Dr. Linton's brow furrowed. "Have you ever known?" "No," Elizabeth Hargrave simply replied. "But I remember her before." She departed. She used to whistle when she baked, always in a minor tone. They sat in silence for a moment more until Miss Marple stood and grabbed a small jar from her closet. Inside were cloves, sharp and fragrant, and I remember she murmured, "This mystery has nothing to do with what was added." Dr. Linton looked bewildered, and Miss Marple gave a small smile. What was left out? Chapter 5. The first bag of flour had come on a Monday. That minor detail stuck in Miss Marple's thoughts as she entered inside Hargrave's bakery for the third time that week. The smell inside had moved less welcoming somehow. The sweetness now appeared to lay on top of something earthier, heavier. Elizabeth stood at the counter stacking almond biscuits with thoughtful care. A bowl of unshaped dough remained beside her, and for a minute Miss Marple simply watched the way her fingers pressed into its solid repetitive distance, then whispered, "Gently, can I ask you something a little peculiar?" "Elizabeth did not look up from you." "I expected nothing less." Miss Marple offered a modest grin. "The flour you use, where do you acquire it from?" "That made Pa's Westminster Mills." She said, "Since I reopened, they make smaller deliveries. The others were too large for one pair of hands." "Not from your old supplier?" "No," Elizabeth replied bluntly. "Bernard's supplier is long gone, as is the man who insisted on it. Does this new flour ever arrive primexed unique blends?" "I use plain and rye for the loaves, nothing special." Miss Marple hesitated, then pointed to the last sack near the oven, saying, "May I?" Elizabeth gave a nod. Miss Marple moved carefully to the bag and pinched a bit between her fingers. The texture was soft, fine, but not uniform. A trace of darker speckling ran through it, not enough to see from afar, but up close interesting. She murmured, "What are you thinking?" Elizabeth asked, wiping her hands. "Only that I was once told rye absorbs bitterness better than wheat." "Curious, isn't it?" Elizabeth's jaw stiffened. "If you're implying I've done something to that man, I'm implying." Miss Marple said calmly, only noting how ingredients sometimes tell stories before people do later that day. In the quiet of her kitchen, Miss Marple laid out the pieces again. 2 people fell ill after the harvest tea. Both had partaken in the sponge cake. One had also eaten the tart. But what if the common thread wasn't what they consumed, but what had changed about it? The sponge had been too perfect. Its structure, its taste, its eerily elegant appearance. Elizabeth was good, but even she had never baked like that before. And now the flour new, unfamiliar, containing something darker than it appeared. She retrieved a small envelope from her desk. Into it, she shook a sample of the flour and sealed it shut. Tomorrow she'd post it to her cousin Carolyn in Eastbourne, who knew a thing or two about agricultural analysis. One didn't spend 5 decades tending to victory gardens without picking up the odd skill, but there was something else bothering her. Why had switched to rye at all? The answer came not from Elizabeth, but from Reverend Sims. He had a fondness for his garden and a deep dislike for baking, but often passed the bakery on his morning walks. Miss Marple found him tending to his chrysanthemums near the chapel. "Miss Marple," he greeted, brushing his hands clean. "Come to admire my yellow heads always," she said with warmth. "Though I hope to pick your brain. I assure you it's mostly compost these days." She smiled politely. "You mentioned something at the harvest tea to Ellsworth about ghosts not liking company." "Oh," he cleared his throat. "Just a poor joke, really. I didn't mean anything sinister. I never took you for a man who speaks." Carelessly he looked sheepish. "Well, there were whispers about Bernard Hargrave." "What sort of whispers?" The Reverend hesitated. "Then that he found something in the bakery pantry shortly before his death. Something he shouldn't have." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Do you know what it was?" "No, but I remember he ordered new sacks of flour a week before he passed, then canceled." The order the day after, and told no one, not that I know of, but else shut the bakery the very next morning that night. Miss Marple sat in bed with a lap rug and an open diary. She wrote nothing, just traced the events in her mind. Bernard Hargrave had found something, perhaps in the flour, perhaps not. He died shortly after, quietly, with little fanfare. No suspicion. Elizabeth fled the village. Now she was back with cake, with new flour, with an inscription that dared to say to sweet endings. And someone else had known, because someone had written the word forgive. But it wasn't forgiveness that had followed. It was illness and silence. The pantry was smaller than Miss Marple remembered. She hadn't been inside Hargrave's bakery kitchen since before the war, before ration cards and blackouts had turned flour into treasure. But the bones of the place hadn't changed. Thick stone walls, cold flagstone underfoot, shelves stacked with jars, tins, and quietly whispering memories. Elizabeth had not extended an invitation this time. Miss Marple had asked, "I'd like to see the pantry," after purchasing a modest oat biscuit and declining the tart. Elizabeth had hesitated, her hand resting on the countertop as if bracing herself. But after a long pause, she'd given a short nod. "Follow me." The pantry door creaked open on its hinges. A faint coolness clung to the air within, sharpened by the scent of cloves and old wood. Miss Marple stepped inside. Neatly labeled jars lined one side, apple preserves, cinnamon sticks, trial, in small glass pots on the opposite wall. Sacks of flour sat stacked in quiet rows, white rye one unmarked, and near the back, partially hidden behind a shelf of bread tins, was something unexpected. A mirror, ancient, rectangular, and stained with years of humidity and dust. It hung too low to be utilitarian, too shaded to be decorative. Elizabeth's voice drifted from behind her. "Bernard hung it. He said it helped with light, but it never did." Miss Marple stepped closer. The glass was fogged around the edges, but intact. As she adjusted her angle, her own reflection came into view, muted, slightly distorted by grime. But something else caught her eye in the corner, tucked just behind the frames. Lower edge was a sliver of paper, barely visible. Miss Marple moved forward gently. "Elizabeth," she whispered without turning, "may I?" "Silence then, if you must." The paper slid free with a faint rasp. It was brittle brown with age, a torn scrap, part of a letter. Miss Marple held it beneath the light. The ink had faded, but the handwriting was clear. The same precise style as the earlier envelope. The sentence incomplete. What he found in the flour was only half the truth. It was what he heard through the, and then it ended, ripped clean. Miss Marple looked up at the mirror again. Her eyes scanned the reflection, and she saw it a faint no. A little portion of the stonework didn't match the rest. "A hatch," she murmured softly, and Elizabeth stood still behind her. "He never told me what it was for, but he knew about it, and so did someone else." Elizabeth nodded, "which is why I left." Miss Marple turned fully, not because of Bernard's death. Elizabeth's eyes glistened because the day before he died, I saw him stare at this mirror for an hour straight before he came to me and remarked, "Some things don't spoil in the pantry. Otherwise, they rot in the walls." Later that evening, Miss Marple sat at her writing desk, the torn letter now pressed between pages of her notebook, a sliver of hidden truth half buried behind a mirror, long forgotten. But why and what had Bernard heard? She traced the sentence again with her fingertip. What he found in the flour, yes, but something else, a sound, a voice, a confession, someone listening or being overheard. She prepared a list in her thoughts. Bernard finds something, cancels an order, and dies soon after. Youth fled. A note is concealed, a mirror obscures a passage, and someone goes to the same pantry about 2 decades later and leaves another message. Forgive. The truth wasn't just baked in. It had been stored, sealed, and hidden in layers, physical and emotional. The following morning brought another shift. News spread through the village that Ivy Broadley had been visited in the night by someone she swore she didn't recognize. He knocked, she said, standing on her porch in a house. Coat and slippers at 2, just one knock, no sound after that. When I looked out the window, there was no one, only a letter slid under the door. Miss Marple stood by the gate, May I see it? Ivy hesitated, then handed it over. Her hands shook more than usual. The Miss Marple didn't blink. Did you speak to anyone about Ellsworth yesterday? Only you. Miss Marple looked up slowly. Something had stirred. The flower had carried one kind of truth, the mirror another, but now the past wasn't just whispering. It was knocking. Chapter 7. The door at the back of the bakery had always been locked. It led to what villagers called the flower room, a squat storage space built into the back of the property. Bernard Hargrave once claimed it was where the cold kept best, thick-walled with no windows, and only one narrow vent above the ceiling joist. But it was more than a pantry. It was private, quiet, and sealed after his death, padlocked and ignored. Until now, Miss Marple stood before it with Elbeth by her side. The key clicked, the door opened with a reluctant groan inside. The air was stale and oddly perfumed, something like lavender or cloves, or both, grown heavy with time. Miss Marple stepped forward, her cane tapping gently against the stone floor, shelves lined the walls sagging slightly under the weight of old tins and flour sacks. But it wasn't the supplies that held her gaze. It was the armchair in the corner, faded, worn, covered in a checkered throw, too domestic for a storeroom. A small side table sat beside it with an empty teacup and a closed book, Pliny's Natural History. The spine cracked and turned yellow. Elizabeth, Miss Marple remarked quietly. Someone sat here often. Elizabeth stared. Breath caught that. That wasn't mine. They circled the room slowly. Behind the chair, tucked into the narrow vent, was something stranger still. A cushion torn, stuffed into the opening to block sound. Dusty, but not old. Not years old. Someone's been using this space recently. Miss Marple said. Elizabeth backed a step. No one has a key except me. Then someone has another. Miss Marple crouched with effort and peered beneath the chair. There, almost hidden against the skirting board, lay a glass jar. Inside it, white powder, coarser than flour. A faintly sweet aroma clung to the lid. She opened it. Cinnamon, she thought at first, but then something else, and just as quickly she closed it again. Do you recognize this? She asked. Elizabeth shook her head. No, I've never seen that before. Miss Marple tucked the jar into her bag, wrapping it carefully in a handkerchief. Miss Marple inspected the powder under brilliant lamplight. It wasn't cinnamon at all. It had flecks of something crystalline, not enough to startle the senses on taste, but enough to change one's health in little cumulative doses. It reminded her of an old case she'd heard whispered about in St. Mary Me in the late 1920s. A gardener had laced jam with small amounts of scopolamine to dull his master's senses before a theft, a compound found in nightshade. A slow-working agent, bitter only when isolated, but in sponge cake or fruit tart, it would disappear completely. The next morning, Miss Marple returned to the bakery, not to Ellsworth, but to the old foundation records at the parish hall. She spent an hour thumbing through building plans, burial maps, and permits. Then she found it, the original diagram of the bakery's layout, hand-sketched in 1912. There had been no flour room in the original plans. That extension had been added quietly in 1936, without permit or note. Curious, and it had one unusual feature: a separate external door, once leading into the alley behind the church wall. Miss Marple circled it on the map. That door was now bricked up, but once it had opened directly into the room with the chair. By dusk, she had arranged a visit with Harold Duckworth, now bedridden, pale but conscious, propped up in the sitting room by the window. He looked older than she remembered. Smaller. Miss Marple, he rasped. Come to ask about the bakery. She raised an eyebrow. Should I? His laugh was dry. You already know something's wrong. I've seen your type before. You look gentle, but you dig like a terrier. I do try. Coughed weakly. I told Bernard not to go through with it, with what, shutting it down, the flour room. The ledgers he wanted to sell the bakery. Entirely said he couldn't take what he'd found. And what had he found? Mr. Duckworth. Harold's eyes unfocused slightly. It wasn't what it was. Who? There was a long silence. Miss Marple leaned in. And who was it? But Harold simply blinked slowly, his breath fading. Too late for that now. And he closed his eyes. Moments later, asleep. Miss Marple stood at his gate as the sun dipped behind the rooftops. Wind carried the scent of distant smoke and fallen leaves. Someone had been inside that bakery, not Bernard. Someone who used the locked room like a sanctuary, who came and went. In silence, who knew where to sit to listen through walls, and who had access to something rare enough to sicken without killing a ghost. Who never left, not a haunting a man, and Miss Marple was certain he was still there. Chapter 8. The Old Ledgers were in the parish archive, tucked within a metal cabinet that hadn't been opened in years. Miss Marple had asked politely, never demanding, always compassionate, and the key had been delivered to her by Mr. Tillman, the church warden, with a curious smile and a whisper, most of it's dust, you know, but dust in Miss Marple's experience had a way of clinging to truth. Inside the cabinet, beneath census pages and tithe receipts, she found what she was looking for. A stack of tan-bound bakery records, dated 1934 to 1940, each labeled in Bernard Hargrave's square economical hand. She moved the final 2 books to the reading table by the chapel window, where the early sun slanted through the frosted glass, lighting the ink like embers. The numbers were neat inventory and tallies of flour and yeast, but as her eye traveled across the sheets, something struck out. 2 notations repeated across several months, marked in pencil, personal credit, GB, free of charge. No amounts, no explanation, just the initials GB. Miss Marple tapped her finger on the margin. Not a supplier, not a known customer, but someone who was allowed quietly, consistently to take goods without payment, and the handwriting changed. Slightly beside these entries, not Bernard's, another hand. Smaller, more angled, possibly Ellsworth's, but why track unpaid goods so discreetly unless there was guilt involved? She flipped to the final page, one last entry, date smeared, delivery rejected. Bernard interjected, making GB upset, and suddenly nothing but a blank page. Miss Marple returned the ledgers and returned to Ivy Broadley's orchard. She found Ivy in the side garden, plucking dead leaves from her bed. "Ivy," she said quietly. The widow stood slowly, brushing soil from her palms. "You've got that look again." "What look?" "The one that says something terrible's happened. But you don't want to frighten people just yet." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Perhaps I just came for conversation." Ivy arched a brow. Miss Marple asked gently, "Do the initials DB mean anything to you? You hate small talk," which was true. Ivy's jaw clenched as her gaze dropped to the herbs. "Where did you find that in Bernard Hargrave's ledger?" Ivy turned away. Miss Marple asked softly, "You knew who he was, didn't you?" "George Batley." Miss Marple nodded, allowing the silence to linger. Ivy's voice was softer when it returned. "He was the old baker's assistant before the war. He lived behind the bakery for a time when his wife left him. No one knew where he went after Bernard died." "Do you think he ever left at all?" Vision didn't answer right away. "No, you saw him only once years ago, just a shape in the alley. He'd aged, but it was him." Watching Miss Marple's mind stirred. "And you didn't tell anyone who would believe. A man considered gone for nearly 20 years, living as a shadow in a bakery. But he had access." Miss Marple remarked to the pantry, the flour room, the mirror, and the sponge, while Ivy mumbled. They stood in silence, interrupted only by the distant clatter of a milk cart, until Ivy questioned, "Is he the one who poisoned Harold?" "I don't know yet," Miss Marple said, "but he's not done that evening." Miss Marple did something she rarely did. She went to the bakery after dark. Elizabeth answered the door with surprise, apron dusted in flour, sleeves rolled to her elbows. "I didn't expect visitors." Miss Marple stepped inside, "and I hoped we could talk." Elizabeth took her to the kitchen, where the oven was warm and the dough was rising silently beneath a towel. The area appeared serene, but Miss Marple's gaze shifted to the door to the flour room. "Elizabeth," she murmured softly, "did you ever know someone named George Batley?" Elle's face went rigid without a blink or a breath. "Where did you hear that name in Bernard's ledger?" Elizabeth slowly sat at the edge of a chore stool. "I thought he left." "Everyone did, but someone's been in that room, someone who knew how the bakery worked." Who knew the layout? Who knew you her hands? Trembled slightly. He was Bernard's mistake took him in out of pity, gave him food, work, and shelter, but he was never right. Miss Marple is quiet, angry, and always listens. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to find the back door open. Stuff had moved, and Bernard discovered something in the ledger. George had been taking stuff, not just wheat money, preserves, and tea, but Bernard never challenged him because he was terrified of what Elizabeth saw when she was alone with him. Miss Marple left the bakery with a quiet ache in her chest. It was not only guilt that haunted that place, but also survival. She paused at the alley wall, which once hid a door somewhere in the narrowing space between memory and dust. George had survived unseen and unheard until now, and if Miss Marple was correct, he had never stopped watching. Chapter 9. For days, the window above the bakery's side alley had gone unnoticed. It wasn't large, no more than a foot wide, framed and rusted. Iron positioned just above head height on the building's eastern wall. Ivy broadly remembered it, only because her mother had once pointed it out when Ivy was a girl. It's how the heat escapes, she had said. But some say it was made for watching. That phrase returned to Miss Marple as she stood beneath the window that morning, peering up through a fringe of ivy and dust. The alley was quiet, as it always was, a narrow gap between the bakery and the old vicarage, now home to the new parish secretary. No one ever walked this way unless they had a reason. She stepped back just enough to catch the angle of the glass. It was too small for a person to climb through, too high to glance in without effort, but just right to observe from inside. If someone stood in the flower room's rear corner, they'd see the alley clearly, and from the alley with careful positioning you could see into the bakery, specifically the oven. The thought was unsettling. Whoever had watched from that window had seen more than comings and goings. They had seen what was baked, when it was prepared, and who entered the back of the bakery, and who didn't leave. Miss Marple spent the afternoon at her writing desk, collecting fragments, a ledger with discrete credits to GB, a sealed pantry with a single armchair, a mirror that faced a false seam in the wall, and now a window made not for light but for surveillance. George Batley had never left the bakery. That much felt certain. He had stayed behind after Bernard's death, perhaps hiding from something, perhaps waiting, but for what? The motive remained elusive. The poison, if that's what it was, had never been conclusively diagnosed, and still Harold Duckworth remained bedbound, his wife still healing. Miss Marple resorted to the vial of white powder she had concealed in her cupboard, and Caroline and Eastbourne had swiftly written back. Scopolamine extract from nightshade, not strychnine or arsenic, causes confusion in low dosages. Nausea, prolonged exposure worsens symptoms masked by sugar. Not easily traced, it was a perfect choice for a slow kind of revenge, subtle, silent, and possibly decades in the making. That evening, Miss Marple paid another visit to Dr. Linton. He met her at the door with his coat half on and spectacles perched at the tip of his nose. "I've been thinking about Harold," he said before she could even speak. "As have I. I tested a hair sample off the record, trace alkaloids consistent with." Miss Marple hesitated. "And what about the bakery's water supply?" "Doctor." Linton blinked. "You think it's the water. I think it's the flour, or perhaps both." He seemed unsettled. "You feel this was planned?" "I believe someone wanted him confused, weak, and incapable of clear recollection. But why Harold?" Miss Marple looked out the window, taught the direction of the bakery. "Because he knew something," she said quietly, "and because he didn't stay silent later that night as the wind stirred the branches." Along Church Lane, Miss Marple visited the bakery for the final time. That week, Elizabeth was cleaning, her sleeves rolled up, the counters gleaming, but her face looked drawn, as though sleep had eluded her. "I've been thinking," she said before Miss Marple could ask anything about the Elizabeth gulped hard. 3 nights ago, at the edge of the flower room, there was just a shadow, but I knew it was him. And what did he do? Nothing. He stood still and watched me." Miss Marple came forward. "I suppose he never left because he didn't want to be found." Elizabeth's voice shook slightly. "I think he blames me for Bernard, for what occurred in that room." Miss Marple was quiet for a minute before saying gently, "That's something else, isn't there?" Elizabeth turned to the counter and lifted a bundle of papers tied with twine. "I found these hidden in the lining of the flower bin letters, all from George, Miss Marple." I opened the top one. The handwriting matched the envelope, tight, controlled. "I kept watch. I kept quiet. You lied." He knew. I heard it through the wall. And another. "The window sees everything. You can't frost over guilt." Miss Marple read the third. Aloud they pleaded the truth, but it burnt on the inside. There was no signature, but the voice was unmistakable. Paranoia interwoven with agony. Else murmured, "I believe he's still within there hiding." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Then it's time to bring him out." Chapter 10. The plan began with Cinnamon. Miss Marple had always said that the best traps weren't made with rope or locks, but with expectation. People moved toward familiarity, toward rituals. Especially when guilt had hardened into habit. Elizabeth hesitated at first. "You want me to bake it again?" Miss Marple gave a gentle nod, exactly as before. Same sponge, same message. Similar show to sweet endings. "Yes," Elizabeth swallowed. "You think he'll come back?" "I think he never left, and something about that sponge stirred him. Perhaps the words or the act of it. But he responded. And if we want him to step forward, we must speak in the language he's been watching." It was decided quietly behind locked doors, with flour dusting the air and dusk drawing long shadows across the bakery floor. The sponge was prepared 2 mornings later, and Elizabeth worked in silence. Her movements were Miss Marple sat in the corner, knitting, resting in her lap, watching every flick of the wrist. The ingredients were measured to the gram. Eggs cracked without waste, flour sifted thrice, but this time Miss Marple made one modest suggestion: add the old rye. Elizabeth halted. "The one with the darker specks." Miss Marple nodded, just enough to provide texture, but not enough to change the taste. Elizabeth obeyed, despite her hands shaking slightly as she stirred it in the oven. Groaned as it took the cake, the scent filled the bakery with something richer than sweetness, something almost ancient, as if memory itself had been folded into the batter. Miss Marple glanced at the side window. She had brushed the ivy away earlier. If someone were watching now, they would see clearly. They would see Elizabeth alone, baking as if nothing had changed. And when the cake emerged, golden risen and dusted, Elizabeth iced the message in the same looping hand to sweeten. That night they waited. The bakery was closed, lights low. Miss Marple sat at the edge of the flower room, the door left ajar just slightly. Elizabeth remained in the front room, pretending to clean it. It was nearly midnight when the silence shifted. A creak near the pantry wall, a breath against the mirror's glass. Miss Marple didn't move. She listened. Then the quiet scrape of the flour bin sliding. And eventually the whisper, not words yet, just the sound of breath twisted by speech memory. She stood quietly and stepped into the flower room. There was a man, gaunt, gray, wrapped in layers of cloth and shadow. His eyes gleamed feral and bright, and in his hands he held the sponge cake, a single piece torn away. "George Batley," he turned at her presence, but didn't flee. Miss Marple said nothing at first, only moved slowly, gently, as though approaching a wounded bird. "You returned for it," she said softly. He didn't answer. "You read the message." His gaze shifted to the mirror. "I knew," he rasped. "I knew what they were doing. They poisoned Bernard. You wrote it in your letters." After hearing it through the vent, he confronted her. She yelled, "I saw it all." "Do you think Elizabeth killed him?" George nodded slowly and confidently, but she didn't. Miss Marple replied gently, "Bernard had a heart issue, according to the coroner's report, and his death was natural. You blamed her for staying because you had nowhere else to go." George's hands tightened around the plate. "She took the bakery. She inherited the bakery. You remained in the walls, feeding off scraps, stealing flour, mixing powders to keep people weak. But why? Harold, he came at night snooping. I saw him near the pantry. He'd found my room. You would have told. So I gave him just enough to make him forget and doubt what he saw." Miss Marple's voice softened. "You didn't mean to hurt him, did you?" His hands shook. "They never saw me, and I didn't want him to stop." Miss Marple moved closer. "But you needed to be heard." I watched her every morning, every cake, every smile. His voice broke, and then that message. She was mocking him, mocking me. No, George, Miss Marple stated that. It was grief and perhaps guilt, but not malice. He gazed down at the sponge. I thought I was protecting him, he mumbled. I believe. You did what you thought was right, Miss Marple spoke behind her. Elizabeth stood silently at the threshold, her voice shaking. Why didn't you leave? George turned slowly since this is the only place I existed, and Dr. Linton collected George. Shortly before dawn, there was no struggle, simply a quiet, serious surrender. He was gently escorted to the hospital for assessment, his notes, jars, and concealed substances removed from the pantry's fake wall. Elizabeth said nothing for a long time, then murmured as the light crept through the bakery window. I think he really believed Bernard was murdered, Miss Marple agreed. Some ghosts don't die. They root themselves in misunderstanding. Elizabeth placed a hand on the counter. Will Harold recover in time? Miss Marple stated that he will forget some, but not all, and Miss Marple's voice was calm. Will be somewhere quiet, somewhere safe, a place where his narrative can conclude sweetly. They stood there in the bakery's warmth, the cake still untouched behind the glass dome, its message finally making sense. Chapter 11. There were things Miss Marple never believed in, coincidences for neat resolutions for another. But on that pale Sunday morning, with the bakery's shutters drawn and George Batley under observation at the county infirmary, the village of St. Mildred's exhaled as if the tale had ended, but it hadn't, because something still didn't sit right. Miss Marple sat at her table with a single sheet of paper, a pointed pencil, and her own orderly mind. She wasn't crocheting today. She was unwinding something else. The series of events. Bernard Hargrave dies of natural causes, but shortly after, a startling finding in the pantry. Ellsworth departs the hamlet promptly. George Batley disappears from public view, assumed dead, but stays hidden, as ledger entries demonstrate. George continued gathering supplies even after Bernard's death. Years later, Ellsworth reappears and revives the bakery. The message to sweet endings is iced on a cake. Harold Duckworth falls. A note is found in the flower room. Forgive Ivy receives a letter. You were wrong. George is found. He confesses to poisoning Harold in small doses. Motive. The case of paranoia, sadness, and misinterpretation was closed. But Miss Marple couldn't ignore the missing link, the note of forgiveness. George had written the others. His tone had been angry, warped by years of isolation, but this one, this single clean word carried none of that rage. It wasn't his voice, and something else had been bothering her since Harold's visit, the last coherent sentence he'd spoken. It wasn't what it was. Who she returned to Ivy Broadley's orchard in the afternoon, walking the path, as if pulled by something deeper than curiosity. Ivy greeted her with a raised brow. Don't tell me it's not of Miss Marple. Smiled softly. I guess it's almost over, but I still have questions. Ivy folded her arms around George. No, Miss Marple inquired. About you? Ivy did not flinch, but her expression became guarded. Do you remember the ledger? Miss Marple inquired. The one with the GB notations? Yes. Were you ever aware of what Bernard planned to do with the bakery? Ivy hesitated. I knew he wanted to sell, he said. It had become too much, but you disapproved. I thought he was giving up too soon. She admitted. I'd invested a lot in the orchard by then. We'd had arrangements, exchanges, apple deliveries in return for his yeast and sugar during rationing. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. You were worried you'd lose access, that the next owner wouldn't honor your informal system. Maybe for Miss Marple said, but it explained something. I wondered. She reached into her bag and retrieved the folded scrap. Forgive, this wasn't George's doing, Miss Marple said. His notes were unhinged, desperate. But this was calm, intentional. Someone tried to halt something before it began. Ivy looked away. I believe you left it, Miss Marple said, because you knew George was still there, because you'd seen him, and because you feared what would happen when. Elizabeth returned silence. Stretched. The leaves shifted faintly above them. I didn't think Harold. Miss Marple Inquired why the letter with those 3 words you were wrong. Ivy's eyes dropped when he came to me the day before the tea and claimed he had found signs. Miss Marple returned to the bakery with her thoughts in order. Elizabeth met her at the door, flour still on her apron, her expression weary but waiting. "You've solved something, haven't you?" she asked. Miss Marple stepped inside something. George, couldn't she laid the paper on the counter? This note, forgive, was not his, it was Ivy's. Elizabeth's breath caught. She saw George once years ago. Possibly more than once. She kept the secret out of fear or shame until Harold began to dig. "Why not tell me?" "Because forgiveness is difficult, Miss Hargrave, especially when the hurt was shared." Elizabeth leaned on the counter, steadying herself. I should have recognized the way Ivy looked at the bakery. It was never simply cake and sugar to her, but remembrance and regret. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "We carry more than our names. Sometimes shame clings to the walls, sometimes it hides in the flowers." Elizabeth was silent for a long time before finally saying, "And what happens now?" Miss Marple's voice was quiet once we let the truth rest. "George will be taken care of, Harold will heal, and you, if you choose, can finally bake for the living rather than the ghosts." They stood in silence as the oven switched off behind them. No more messages, no more watches in the walls, only heat and calm. Chapter 12. The bakery reopened 1 week later, just as discreetly as it had closed. There were no banners, no notification. In the parish circular, Miss Marple passed by the shop without entering, but the bright glow behind the window panes and the aroma of rising bread floating into the morning air told her the door was open again inside. Elizabeth worked alone as before, but her actions had changed. She no longer maintained her back to the mirror and no longer looked over her shoulder between batches. The flour room remained sealed, but not out of fear, but out of respect. There were no more iced messages, no more sponge cakes crowned with riddles. Only fresh loaves, shortbread, and a jar by the till collecting coins for the infirmary. Harold Duckworth was walking again, slower than before, but steadier. His memory had gaps, but some things remained clear. He no longer passed the bakery without looking in, and Ivy Broadley returned to her orchard without fuss through the village. The truth, when presented clearly, was not scandalous. There was no violent clash, no grand villain to be marched away in chains. The truth had crept softly and gentle over 2 decades. George Batley had become a ghost by choice. He had observed, heard, and believed he knew what had happened. But as Miss Marple had frequently noted, belief could be just as hazardous as certainty. His letters were now held in a manila envelope at the local constable's office. The powder sample was transported to a discreet laboratory in Sussex, and the case was formally concluded with a diagnosis of extended psychological pain and latent sadness leading to misdirected action. No charges were filed. George had already served his sentence, but the mystery had left its mark on flour bins, mirror glass in ivy-covered windows, and scratched jar lids in quiet. Miss Marple sat in her cottage garden as autumn crept toward winter. The wind carried a crisp bite, and the hydrangeas had browned at the edges. She poured herself a modest cup of tea and stared down at the newspaper folded on her lap. It was the obituary section, not out of morbid habit, but quiet ritual. No deaths today, only a notice at the bottom corner. "Thank you to all who supported the bakery's reopening in memory of Bernard Hargrave, whose legacy rises daily. Miss Marple Sem." She turned her coat collar against the breeze. "I made something for you," she informed me. "Not a message, just a recipe." Miss Marple grabbed the bag and cautiously opened it. Within was a single slice of Victoria's sponge, plain, undecorated, delicate to the touch. No sugar dusting, no writing, just the cake and something beneath it. Miss Marple carefully lifted a slip of paper. "This one is for beginning again." No signature was required, so she invited Elizabeth in for tea, and the 2 women sat beneath the ticking clock, sipping in silence as the lamplight warmed the walls. Miss Marple didn't ask what else she planned to do with the rest of her life. Some questions were better left unanswered, and some slices were better left uneaten. The harvest tea resumed the following year, simpler without sponge cakes or dedications. Mrs. Duckworth brought ginger biscuits. Ivy's tart returned, but with no added flair, only a modest crimped crust and an honest dash of cloves. No one mentioned the incident aloud, but when they passed the bakery, they walked a little slower. When the wind rustled between the walls near Church Lane, they paused, listening for what they weren't sure. But something had passed through the village, a ghost, a grief, a truth that didn't scream but settled. And in the middle of it all, a quiet woman with knitting needles and sharp eyes had caught the thread, followed it to the end, and tied it off with care. Miss Marple sat alone after her guest had left, placing the unopened slice of sponge behind a glass dome on the counter. She would not eat it, not because she dreaded it, but because some endings ought to be treasured, not devoured, only remembered.